Billy. Ah, there you are already. Be welcome and greetings. Ta. Greetings also, dear friend, Edouard. Today I really have enough time, which is why I also want to bring up various questions that relate to incidents that my father mentioned in his records in his annals. Bermunda also wants to come here later, because she wants to deal with the portraits that have been done variously. Billy. There I am available to answer your questions, of course, to give answers, at least as far as I can remember. Then what Bermunda will have in terms of portraits, I will be surprised. Ta. When I bring up the questions, I think your memory will also stir. Yes, I'm sure it will, because questions also contain clues, which I'm sure will stir memories. Billy. You may well be right, but the question is how far these then emerge from memory. Ta. Yes, that is so, but some things will. Billy. Good, so be it. But, Ta, before you start with the questions, I would first like to talk about what is coming up concerning the corona plague, because I want to put this in writing in the contact report. It is now the time when the epidemic strikes again and the theater starts all over again. The governments in all countries have acted so irresponsibly that they have abolished the general obligation to wear masks when dealing with foreign human beings in department stores, shops and public buildings, etc., which will now take its revenge, because I know that the epidemic will now strike again. You also explained that the vaccines that were so suddenly put into use were not harmless, that they would not only pass into the blood and possibly damage it. The real beginning of the corona epidemic, which caused many deaths, actually started when vaccination began with vaccines that came on the market so suddenly, as never before in the outbreak of an epidemic. It was obvious that the more vaccinations were given, the more human beings died, which was not surprising. You also said that the vaccine still needed years of testing to be truly effective, but that the epidemic would subside on its own over time, but that many human beings would have after effects that would also last a lifetime. You also said that the disease would continue to exist in the body as a result of impulses, but the earthly doctors do not know anything about this because they do not have the means to determine this. Basically, they do not even know that something can be impulsively deposited in the organism, such as illnesses, poison, other harmful substances, and even metal, etc. They also do not know that a person from the corona can be infected with a disease. Spath has already said that a person can be affected by the corona plague several times, even 6 or even more times. This, as well as the fact that completely different diseases can suddenly appear, which can probably be traced back to the coronavirus, but which cannot be determined. However, the fact that other diseases can be triggered by the lousy vaccinations, that is another factor that is irresponsibly concealed or completely attributed to other causes, etc. Alleged heart attacks, shortness of breath, cramps, abdominal, muscular and back pains, etc., and long-term effects of various kinds, which suddenly bring on some kind of suffering and even end fatally, are not simply consequences of the corona epidemic itself, but as your father Spath said at the time, these will in many cases stem from the vaccinations, which will have chemicals that practically turn into toxins in the organism. What is happening worldwide since the emergence of the epidemic, on the one hand with the epidemic itself, but on the other hand with the vaccinations, coincides with what Spath already explained in the 1940s when we were dealing with the events of the future. But the fact that the epidemic is now on the increase again is really the fault of those in power, who have been completely negligent in issuing the wrong regulations. Everything that is now spreading again with the epidemic could have been avoided, and the corona epidemic could have been contained to such an extent that what is about to happen really could not have come about. Besides, many human lives would not have been left to die if governments had not allowed pseudo-vaccines to be used, as well as later completely untested vaccines. Ta. That is correct. We had clearly established at that time when it all started, that at first only distilled water was used by certain corporations as a supposed vaccine, and then after a short time various dangerous chemicals were added on a trial basis and used for initial testing purposes. Since then, things have changed, but there is still no reliable vaccine that would really be very effective against the corona epidemic. Human beings who are vaccinated with the various common vaccines, which in reality are not yet sufficiently tested and are highly dangerous, are asking for mischief, which means that with every further vaccination the mortality from the vaccinations increases. Years of research are still needed to produce a real vaccine that can be responsibly labeled as such and be effective. And if certain human beings did not die from the administered vaccines and continue not to die, then it was or is their immune systems that were or are so strongly or simply immune to the so-called vaccines that the administered substances simply remained or remain ineffective. These will, however, possibly be deposited in the blood and later possibly cause unpleasant late effects, which, however, cannot be determined by the still very poorly educated earthly doctors and due to the lack of the necessary equipment and possibilities for a very long time, just as the impulsive deposition of the corona plague in the organism and consequently also in the blood cannot be determined. The corona epidemic that has already appeared in 2019, which spread strongly and rapidly throughout the world and became a pandemic, but which has recently diminished in its effect of spreading infection, does not allow all caution to be left out of consideration for this reason. As far as you are concerned, and also all those who belong to the FIGU Association, as well as those who read our conversations on the FIGU website, which you call up and write down and which are also published and widely read, I want to urge that they wear respiratory masks for their own health preservation when they come into contact with fellow human beings who do not belong to the personal field of contact and of whom there is not great certainty that they are not infected with the corona virus. Billy. Good, but what about when passive members work in the center? Do they still need a prior corona test? And what about the visitors who have to register 14 days before they come? Some just come spontaneously. What should one do? Ta. It is good that you ask about that, because I actually wanted to talk to you about that right at the beginning. Unfortunately, I got distracted and forgot about it when you started to speak. So, with regard to your questions, it is to be said that we have consulted and found that it is very detrimental to the spread of the teaching and the whole fabric of knowledge of everything important that is connected with it. The conclusion is that henceforth you can again receive spontaneous visits, and you should of course deal with them in a factual way. However, it is to be noted that the visitors and the FIGA members who are to devote themselves to the task of receiving visitors are necessarily provided with respiratory masks. This should also apply to those visitors who pre-register for a particular appointment in writing, by telephone or by email. We have also discussed that, as far as written proof of corona non-infection is concerned, such proof is not necessarily required for the time being. However, for all spontaneous visits to the center in the cold winter period, the duration of the visit should not exceed 2 hours, but the mask obligation is to be observed and the separating screen between the visitor and the FIGU person must be in your visitor room. Written corona test certificates shall continue to apply to passive members or FIGU friends who complete their work duty in the center, as respiratory masks must be worn when dealing with other persons, whereby in any case only masks of the FFP2 quality may be used. Anyone who is ridiculed for wearing a respiratory mask should not be annoyed or leave the mask aside, because health should be more important. This precautionary measure is still appropriate, because there is a possibility that the disease will mutate again, which could make it worse or result in something that is not a change from the corona disease, but has completely foreign symptoms that are not corona-like. For the epidemic is not yet over, consequently, it still exists and continues to claim lives, especially through the vaccinations of those human beings whose immune systems react dangerously to it. Thus it can be reliably predicted that the so far only laxly and still insufficiently tested vaccines will continue to claim many deaths worldwide if the vaccination campaign continues, which are currently to be calculated at over 8.7 million, whereas according to earthly wrong calculations only about 6.6 million deaths would have to be mourned with regard to the corona plague. Billy. Yes, unfortunately, humanity is lied to and deceived, especially by the media, so there are only a few newspapers and magazines today that really try to spread the truth. Large newspapers have merged into corporations and spread the same lies in their organs, papers/media, just not the truth or small interwoven parts of the truth. The fact that governments have a hand in this is denied, but it is true. And while we are at it, there is also lying and deception about the facts, about what is really happening in Ukraine. This, as well as that since the beginning of the theater, because of NATO, and concerning the war in the background, America alone has been pulling the strings. And that America has turned most of the countries on earth against Russia, and that they are all dancing to America's tune, that is undeniable. The countries of the Earth's West have been incited by the USA, and the rulers of the Western countries are so stupid that they are following the same path that has been and will continue to be imposed on them by America. The stupid governments of the Western countries do not see and do not understand that they are destroying the world order together with the USA and questioning the whole of what has been achieved since the last World War and possibly completely destroying everything and even many human lives. In this way, the USA can bring its hegemonic plans closer to realization, together with the help of NATO, which, however, the stupid ones of the rulers and the part of the peoples neither see nor understand in their skulls brimming with stupidity. Besides, I also want to say, this Zelensky is becoming more and more marked by hatred in his face, to such an extent that it already reminds me frighteningly of what I saw with Hitler when I was able to see him at close quarters together with Svath. I was only 7 years old at the time, but the hateful expression on Hitler's face struck me in such a manner that I have never been able to forget it, even though that was some 80 years ago in this life alone. Zelensky also speaks in a similar manner as Hitler at the time, in his own way of course, but for me it is unmistakable. His actions also seem so Nazi-like to me, so it is also understandable to me that he is called a Nazi by various people, because that is how they assess him. I have also been told on several occasions that the Ukrainian military not only behaves like Nazis and commits atrocities, which they then blame on the Russians, but that many of the military, like Zelensky himself, are Nazis and act accordingly. Moreover, the longer it goes on, the more I notice that German politicians in particular are making primitive and childish speeches against Putin, which could not be more stupid and prove just how out of touch these rulers really are. Their speeches are effectively more childish than childish, stupid, dumb, insulting to intelligentum, illogical and in general not comprehensible in terms of understanding, so that they have exactly the opposite effect of what should actually be intended. These idiotic statements and speeches are still mentioned on television and show how stupid these politicians really are and how they are not able to judge what is actually going on in a human being who is pelted with such idiotic statements, which provoke even more evil to be brought about. When I look at all the hate that is released and take sides with one side or the other, nothing can get better, only worse. For my part, I am only trying to neutrally point out what is happening and what is being done without taking sides, but that is not what those who are biased in helping or disadvantaging one side or the other are doing. What you are saying, this is nothing new to you or to me, because with Florina and Bermuda you yourself have. Billy. Yes, I know, but I do not want to talk about that. I understand that. But it must still be said that what you said about America's deviousness corresponds to the truth. America's governance and dark state leadership are the real driving force behind the ongoing war disaster in Ukraine. America is undoubtedly the driving and leading force of this war, which is being waged in the interest and zeal for the will of the world domination mania of the officially authoritative state leadership and the dark state leadership of America working covertly in the background in Ukraine. These two American forms of state leadership are the real initiators and warmongers who are waging war in Ukraine and spending billions of dollars on it and putting the over-indebted state even more into debt. This is mainly done through large arms deliveries, as other states are also urged to do, which Zelensky also unabashedly begs for and is heeded without hesitation. In this way, by receiving the begged-for weapons, he is able to keep the war going longer and longer, and this in the interests of the Americans, who are addicted to world domination, as he is also able to satisfy his own lust for war. What the Americans are doing, together with their vassal Zelensky, they are doing solely to get closer to their addiction and their will for world domination, i.e. not to help Ukraine and its people. In truth, the only reason behind it is their desire for world domination, and for this the really stupid man Zelensky is the correct vassal to do everything in America's interest that will benefit their desire. However, the state leaders, who are also obsessed with power and do not think for themselves, do not recognize this and supply weapons to Zelensky, just as the American-influenced sections of the population of the most diverse states do not recognize this, who shout pro and hurrah and support the supply of weapons to Zelensky and have them supplied. The people of Ukraine are also blind and non-thinking, because they do not realize that their leader Zelensky is a passionate fanatical warmonger beyond compare, who, as a trained comedian and actor, deceives and abuses the Ukrainian population and military for his fanatical lust for war and thereby consciencelessly sends them to their deaths and destroys the country. Zelensky himself is a very unpredictable, vicious and, moreover, unusually conscienceless as well as hateful man against Russia and a warmonger who unthinkingly and irresponsibly, as well as obsessed with power, chases the military of Ukraine into war and death. He believes himself to be great and insurmountable, and in his irrationality he also talks in a confused and insane manner and incites and threatens against Russia, against Putin with lies and ill-considered assumptions and promotes fear in the world. He is so stupid, not thinking and not foreseeing far enough that he does not realize through his speeches of stupidity that he is provoking a world war and even a nuclear war, which is definitely in the sense of America, which wants to take countermeasures together with NATO, for which certain precautions have been talked about for months. Thus this man Zelensky, in his stupidity, is actually endeavoring to do for America everything that is demanded of him, whereby, through his inability to think, he does not even know this and consequently does not understand it. He acts without considering that one day he will simply be thrown out of favor by America when he is no longer needed for the dirty machinations. That he is risking his own life in this regard is also not thought of by this power-obsessed and megalomaniac, who immediately becomes dejected and helpless when something happens that he cannot predict. Billy. He will experience it and learn about it, because it has been said since time immemorial, when the Moor has done his duty, then he can go. Moreover, it is to be said that not all human beings in the USA agree by a long shot with what the government is doing with regard to the war in Ukraine, the arms deliveries to Zelensky and the billions of dollars in debt the country is incurring for this. These Americans, who do not want the government to act in this way over their heads, are unable to do anything about it and can only make a fist in their pocket without fighting back, which will achieve nothing. These righteous human beings in the USA, however, are also wrongly seen as bad Americans by those who see America as bad, and as such are wrongly condemned as also bad and evil. And these human beings in the USA also have to pay taxes for the irresponsible rulers supplying weapons to Zelensky. But let's not talk about that anymore, because it is probably better that you raise your questions than that we talk about the irresponsible USA rulers and taxpayers as well as the uninvolved people of America, because those idiots of the world population who neither see reality nor its truth and consequently do not understand it, will learn nothing either way and remain stupid, Because they will not learn to think for themselves and consequently remain just of low intelligence/dim all their lives. Ta. I think so too. Good, so let's leave the subject. In my father's annals I read that he undertook many time journeys with you and took you to places on earth and to human beings who were completely different from what is claimed according to tradition and which therefore does not correspond to the truth. In 1947, for example, he took you to the highest mountain, that is, to Everest, where you were able to enter the mountain with a breathing apparatus that also provided warmth and stay there for 40 minutes. This, while otherwise and equally protected, you were able to visit the hottest place on earth, where you stayed for about 6 hours. Billy. Yes, I remember that as well as Mount Everest. It was somewhere in the north in Persia, a desert and hot as hell, which I did not notice, because my suit was cooling. But I do not remember the name of the desert. I was also in hot places elsewhere, so also in Queensland, as well as in Death Valley, etc. I was sometimes with my friends. Partly, I was also on my normal trips in hot deserts and places where otherwise only locals go or are even avoided by them. Ta. In Persia it was the desert-Delat. My father called it the desert of sand. But he also noted that he visited all the great volcanoes of the earth with you. Billy. Yes, that is where I saw the biggest ones and also the most interesting ones. In Europe I actually saw all of them, also the small ones. Also, the Phlegraean fields, Etna and Vesuvius in Italy. Stromboli, one of the world's most active volcanoes, which, by the way, will be making news again these days with new eruptions, has several large underground and, as far as I know, as yet undiscovered sea-bottom volcanoes in its vicinity, while small volcanic fissures and other minor volcanic activity characterize the entire Phlegraean fields and can be observed in many areas as steam or smoke rises from the earth. There are also many such volcanic outcrops at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, volcanic tubes rising from the seabed and emitting black smoke, etc. I also saw not only the very dangerous Yellowstone caldera in America, but also various other calderas on Earth, as well as in the south of Europe, in addition to the volcanoes Vesuvius, Etna, and Stromboli, which I have already mentioned, where there are several submarine volcanoes in the area around it which, as far as I know, have not yet been discovered. I know Stromboli well, because I once had a special experience there. There are also around 1,000 small and larger volcanic underwater ejecta in the Mediterranean. All of them belong to the Phlegraean fields, which all together form an underground active giant caldera, whereby this is heading for a tremendous eruption and will come to an eruption, as will also happen, with the Eiffel caldera in the north of Europe. Ta. You have also seen many other things with my father Svath. Billy. Yes, for example, also probably the largest cave on Earth. This was somewhere in the Far East. Although I do not remember the exact place, but Svath said at that time anyway that I should keep quiet about it, where it is exactly. Ta. So you cannot say that openly? Billy. Yes, that is so, he said it though, I remember that I can tell you when you come here later on then. And if I still knew exactly and said it, just to you, because then in the report would be the usual, because then I would just make dots. Ta. Then we will talk about it later. Billy. Yes, I guess that is correct, because we should only talk to each other privately like that. Ta. That is so. Father's annals also list various incidents you had in North Africa. Billy. Yes, I remember that, but I want to tell you about that later. Also what happened when I was there in the 1950s and 1960s, also in the Sahara. It was not exactly pleasant, because, well, I do not really want to talk about that. But it is perhaps interesting to know that in much earlier times this Sahara Desert was a giant jungle, and also very large areas were very fertile. Everything looked completely different, just as many other areas of the Earth also had a completely different appearance than today. Just 20,000 years were enough for everything to change in such a way that no one would recognize the landscapes today if they had seen them back then. This is also the case with Lake Sonora and the whole area around it, where the dwarfs rest. The small ones lived on the shores of the lake, who settled here about 42,000 years ago, but who migrated again and also died out when, after about 10,000 years, the lake dam broke and the waters poured into the valley. Well, that is how it was, but nobody knows anything about that nowadays, except some of our members, because we found reeds as thick as a thumb during our excavation work when we were digging in the cellar, and also for the fortification of the coach house, because this building stands precisely on the former shore area of Lake Sonora. Ta. I am aware of that because we have talked about it before. But you were also in ancient Egypt with my father, were you? Billy. Yes, we went there. I also met the warrior king there, Sinella or something was his name, but I do not remember exactly. Later, Svath told me that this man was killed murdered. Ta. That is right, that is how it is listed in father's annals. But the name was not Selena, but Pharaoh Senebkai, although he was actually only a war conqueror at first. In fact, he was then assassinated by a descendant of an actual pharaoh's dynasty. Billy. That was about 4,000 years ago or so. Ta. According to father's records, around 1700 BC Jmanuel, just Jesus as he is wrongly called by the Christians and Muslims, although he never bore that name. You were together, but often and at different times in Egypt. Billy. Yes, that is correct, we were there many times, also in those years when a heavy earthquake tore up the ground and the buildings and let them sink into the sea. I remember that at that time there was a man whom Svath knew well and had long conversations with him, while I was able to listen with interest and understand everything through the translator. The man dealt with the stars in the sky, as well as with the earth, the sun and the whole SOL system, and Svath also enlightened him about the fact that the earth moves around the sun in 365 days, as do the other SOL planets, but with completely different orbital periods. Then we were also there, as I said, when a severe earthquake literally tore the land to pieces and destroyed all the city's buildings, after which an even more severe quake followed and everything sank into the sea. Now as for Jmanuel, his name was really Jmanuel, but not Jesus as was imputed to him and is still imputed to him today. He was crucified through the fault of 3 high priests as well as that of a small fanatical group of believers. There were about 10 or 12 people, fanatical followers of the high priests. He was accused by them as an alleged blasphemer of the truth and blasphemer of the doctrine of the Jewish religion to the chief of the Roman occupiers, to Pilate. The 3 high priests and the few fanatical followers from the people succeeded in persuading Pilate that Jmanuel was a criminal against the teaching of Adonai Resp Jod. He. Vav. He. And should therefore be sentenced to death. Pilate did not want this, because he saw no guilt in Jmanuel, but after the efforts of the 3 priests and their fanatical followers, he finally gave in and shifted the blame for the execution onto the Jewish high priests and their fanatical followers, because the Jewish religious law of that time supposedly demanded this punishment, which however corresponded to a lie of the high priests. The fact that the majority of the Jewish people actually saw Jmanuel as a prophesied prophet, that they had been expecting him and waiting for his teaching, corresponded to the facts. The teaching that Jmanuel taught, however, which was completely different from the one that had been handed down, infinitely distorted since ancient times, endangered them and consequently also the high priesthood, because the teaching that Jmanuel brought threatened to dissolve the faith. Therefore, Jmanuel was accused with lies of being a traitor to doctrine and sentenced to death. However, in reality and truth, he was not nailed to a cross, but to a long Y-shaped execution stake, on which he fainted deeply after hours and was considered dead, which is why his followers were allowed to take him down and lay him to rest in a cave outside the city walls of Jerusalem. There, however, he was secretly nursed, and when he regained enough strength to walk, he fled from Jerusalem to Damascus, then northwards to the Greek city of Meier, and then further eastwards until he reached Kashmir, where he was called Yezasaf and where he continued to spread the teaching, which, however, was distorted ad infinitum. Actually, no one knows today why anti-Judaism, why hatred of Jews arose. The consequence of Jmanuel's execution was, what started early on, that the later followers of Jmanuel accused the whole nation of Jews of murdering him, although only their 2 hands full of fanatics managed to condemn Jmanuel to death by lies etc. and have him executed. In fact, this is the reason for the hatred against Jewish believers, the people of the Jews. Consequently, anti-Judaism as an origin is based on a few guilty people who were so fanatically indoctrinated that they themselves were willing to wish death on an innocent person. In this respect, however, this and that is fancifully claimed as the origin of hatred of the Jews. In truth, however, this only arose because there were 3 originators and a few fanatics, i.e. not the people of Israel, who wanted to have Jmanuel murdered. But the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was made out of the real name Jmanuel by crazy people who did not understand him and that they made him the founder of Christianity, actually came only afterwards, when he was already in Kashmir. The fact that many separated themselves from Judaism and turned to the emerging Christianity dragged on for long centuries. The devaluation of the Jewish faith took a long time, as did Christianity, which was able to openly break through to a faith after a very long time. That Jmanuel died for all human beings and should have borne their sins to death, this erroneous idea was still Jewish at that time, and indeed by those apostate Jewish believers who misunderstood and misinterpreted all that Jmanuel brought as a teaching. The believers who misunderstood everything, namely that the teaching that Jmanuel had taught had been dictated by God himself, had thus been completely misunderstood by the followers. This was not unusual, however, because the long-established belief in Adonai and his greatness and omnipotence did not allow for anything else. Moreover, Jmanuel's parents were Jewish, and consequently Jmanuel was also regarded and judged as a Jew, even though he did not represent the Jewish faith. He was probably understood by a large following as an itinerant rabbi, but his teaching was not, and not even what he actually taught. It was not understood that he wanted to teach the good and the correct throughout his life, that he wanted to break down the old faith structures, and that he did so by gently working towards teaching the human beings about the truth, without openly touching their erroneous belief in God. This was more than necessary at that time, because it was life-threatening to say something against God and, in addition, to think for oneself and not simply to think religiously. Nevertheless, 3 high priests recognized what Jmanuel was aiming at and what value his teaching contained, which is why they complained to Pilate against him with insults of lies and demanded death. Jmanuel was never a believer, so he was not a Jew, but only an Israelite. For over 2,000 years, Christianity has concealed and distorted this truth, while the Jews have remained with their old conventional faith, because they could not be taught the truth by Jmanuel and his teachings. It was Jewish believers at that time who were Jmanuel's followers and who misunderstood and misinterpreted his teaching, consequently they spread the teaching according to their wrong understanding, out of which the gospel finally arose. The whole thing was misunderstood by Jmanuel's followers from northern Galilee and spread throughout the world without anyone ever asking about the actual truth, but everything was simply believed without hesitation. This is also why there are so few traces of the religion of Judaism in Christianity. When the followers of Jmanuel separated from Judaism, it was already at the time when Jmanuel was brought to the Y-pole. That was fully enough for Jmanuel's followers to separate from Judaism and curse those who were guilty of Jmanuel being executed. Unfortunately, the result was that many people incited by the guilty, as was customary at the time, as incitement is still customary today, which quickly creates a mob of roaring fanatics, gawked at the execution. Consequently the followers, who were also present in large numbers, insulted the gapers and equated them with the guilty, which was also maintained from then on, and generally the believers in the Jews were held innocently liable for Jmanuel's execution. This was quickly spread everywhere, which also led to the devaluation of the Jewish faith and which resulted in the emerging false faith of Jmanuel's followers. And it was not long before Jmanuel was ascribed a sonship, as a son of, with God, and his teaching, which was misunderstood, was declared to be the word of God, whereby the false belief was formed into the gospel. With this, everything became a faith with such an authoritative character of false correctness that the delusion arose to unconditionally recognize God as the highest authority and one's own actions as his will. This, together with the false letters that were written over a very long period of time again and again by followers of Jmanuel who knew the scriptures and by the followers' successors and their descendants, ultimately resulted in the Jesus faith and then the Christian faith and Christianity. This created the dramatic consequences of bloody Christianity, which claimed millions of human lives over the next more than 2,000 years, both through the persecution of Christians, the witch craze, and also the religious wars, etc., etc. All too often, the Christian faith was increasingly turned into a factor of hatred against the Jews in general, who were allegedly guilty for the execution of Jmanuel, although only a few fanatics were to blame. This is how Christian anti-Judaism actually arose, but not in such a way as old racist writings and mendacious allegations would have us believe, which provided an opportunity a reason an argumentation aid for the persecutions of the Jews and the Holocaust of the World War 1939–1945 by the Nazis. Also, the fact that Jews were good businessmen and quite efficient at it and became filthy rich, such as the Rothschilds, probably the best known, did not suit the Christians, which is why they were hostile to them and still are today. It simply cannot be understood that these human beings worked hard for their wealth, even if there may have been certain irregularities at times, which is certainly not to be denied, but that is human and therefore nothing out of the ordinary. But as it was, one way or another, and that envy and hatred are still being spouted today, that is simply not correct, but corresponds to an evil, reprehensible disposition and proves that the human beings acting in this way have a damned dirty, depraved and lousy character. Consequently they also carelessly torture, murder, destroy and annihilate. If a louse creeps over their liver, they are afflicted with hatred or go to war, etc. Today, there are more and more attacks against Judaism, against those who believe in the Jews, even hunts, acts of violence, riots and attacks against the lives and property of the Jews, whereby, in truth, everything is religiously motivated, but today's Jew haters are often not aware of this. Internationally, however, the concept of anti-Judaism only developed from 1881 onwards, although everything had actually already begun in the 1820s, when Christians from Germany immigrated to the Ukraine and Russia, which then gave rise to the anti-Jewish attacks in Tsarist Russia. These effectively originated from the immigrant Christians from Germany, who founded an underground movement and spread their hostility towards Jews in Russia, mainly also in the Ukraine. It was also this organization that assassinated Tsar Alexander II of Russia, which, however, they mendaciously claimed was the fault of the Jews. This had repercussions until the new millennium, when, shortly after the turn of the century, many Jews were murdered, mainly in Ukraine, with the help of the police and the military. This persecution and murder of Jews lasted almost 20 years and claimed many thousands of lives. However, this was not the end of the persecution of the Jews, but only the beginning of the murder of around 100,000 Jews from 1920 onwards, mainly in the Ukraine, where the Ukrainian People's Army was on a Jew-hating rampage, along with others. At that time Adolf Hitler also came into play, and that already during the World War 1914–1918, when he, as an Austrian, assimilated in Germany and went to war together with Jew haters, who indoctrinated him with their hatred of Jews, and he became an unparalleled Jew hater. When he then managed to come to power in Germany and proclaimed the Great German Reich, the persecution of the Jews really began, forming the Holocaust, and millions upon millions were murdered in gas chambers, beaten to death and shot. But the effective truth of what happened in Ukraine and Russia was deliberately falsified and passed on in such a way that today no one knows the truth of the effectively truthful events. Consequently, the human beings take the lying and fraudulently falsified at face value and believe every lie. But this is how everything has been handled on earth since time immemorial. Consequently, lies and deceit rule the world. The people in every country are lied to and deceived, as well as being controlled by a rope of fools. Truly, they are presented with a world history that does not correspond to the effective truth, and is even believed stupidly by the respective rulers, although only a few truths are interwoven into it. So it is that nowadays Germany is once again at the forefront, including the European dictatorship with Ursula von der Leyen, to participate in the Ukraine-Russia war with words and deeds, supposedly in the sense of providing assistance, but in reality, as always, to be the sneaky good guys. But the real reason is concealed, and that part of the people that knows the real truth and is against the actions of the rulers and their fellow travelers from the people has to look down the tube and cannot change anything. This is in addition to the warmongers of the USA, who are in the mood for hegemony and will do anything and everything to achieve their goal. Now, once again, the process of the separation of the followers of Emmanuel from Judaism and the emergence of Christianity is to be mentioned, which was a really creeping process that already began when Emmanuel was saved not as a dead man but as a fainter. His continued life was interpreted as a divine resurrection and spread among the followers of Emmanuel, which quickly spread far and wide like wildfire. This was also brought to the notice of the culprits, who sent out henchmen to kill Emmanuel, but they failed and he escaped to Kashmir. Nevertheless, the followers formed a so-called early church, which dealt with the misunderstood teachings of Emmanuel and found more followers rest believers, namely many of those who saw in Emmanuel the prophet who had been promised to them. They held on to this idea, while the other believers considered everything to be completely absurd and distanced themselves from it. Emmanuel himself never gave a confirming answer to the question whether he was this prophet, but this led to the followers seeing in him all the more the prophet they wanted to see, which has remained so until today, and he is treated as the Son of God. This is actually what I have seen, experienced and learned on the spot during my many journeys with Svath, and that everything is in truth quite different from what has been mendaciously and fraudulently handed down. All religious belief is false either way, and no belief of any kind justifies denigrating, harming or even murdering religious human beings and exterminating them through wars and massacres, as has been the custom since time immemorial, especially with Christianity and Islam, and is still the case today, even if this is officially hypocritically denied and hatred of Jews continues to be secretly cultivated. Unfortunately, this is the truth, because I know this through my investigations, which I have carried out with countless Earth humans who believe in religion. Billy. Exactly, that is also the observation that I myself make again and again. But it occurs to me that Svath has said that climate change then also triggers changes in the Earth's magnetism, which in turn causes environmental influences. That corresponds to correctness, but we should talk about that later, because Billy. Yes, is good. I also learned from Svath that, for example, different suns come into being and pass away again, and also that large suns do not live as long as small ones, rest that large suns are not able to exist as long as small suns, such as ours, around which we orbit with the Earth. About 4 billion years ago, it took 473 days for the Earth to orbit the Sun, but this changed again and again, so that the Earth once needed only 80 days to orbit the Sun at breakneck speed. Once, about 20 million years ago, it took about 425 days, then much later again somewhat less, but then it finally settled down at 365 days and somewhat squeezed hours, as it still is today. As I have seen several times together with Svath, the whole thing of the different length of the Earth's orbit around the Sun resulted from collisions, a simple ramming or also collisions of the Earth with very gigantic or large planetary formations, with large, smaller or small asteroids. As a result, the Earth became faster or slower, depending on the situation, so that it took more or fewer days to orbit the Sun. And as Sfath explained at that time, the orbit around the Sun was also changed, just as the rotation of the Earth around itself, just as the rotation of the axis at its poles underwent a change in rotation, which has been preserved up to the present, whereby the Moon also contributed to this, which only joined later and which came from far away from your universe and was captured by the Earth. Of course, the Earth scientists do not want to admit this and claim that it was formed from the Earth. These luminaries have still not understood that their assumption, like various others, is fundamentally wrong. Many of them also do not understand and do not accept that other planets and other space formations can have exactly the same the same matter compositions as exist on Earth. Also, many other planets carry life forms, some of which are very high in their consciousness development and much more advanced and intelligent than the cleverest Earthlings. Other worlds also have lakes, streams and rivers, forests and seas, and much more that also exists on Earth. It's just that the surfaces of other planets are shaped differently than those of Earth. But the Earthlings are not ready, especially the heroes who cannot imagine, do not understand and do not want to admit that many other worlds in the entire matter belt of the universe are full of life and even carry higher life, which even has highly developed techniques that also allow them to travel through the matter belt, and so on. Very many of our scientists, airheads, I farewell to say, to which also various normal people belong, do not understand that the Earth in the humanly incomprehensible infinity of our creation, which is only a seventh part of all universes of creation, is not alone inseminated and carries life, and partly also more highly intelligent life than exists on our planet. And that our creation consists of 7 universes, each with a matter belt, has not yet been grasped by all those schoolboys who want to know so much about the universe, whose effective number is 7, which in turn are arranged in dimensions of the past and the future. They do know that the matter belt with all its galaxies etc. is expanding more and more, but in truth they do not even know that the origin of creation with its 7 universes was tiny, smaller than an atom when it exploded through the so-called Big Bang, but they only assume suspect it, but do not know how this tiny thing came into being, from which creation with its 7 universes emerged through the Big Bang. Let alone that they have any idea that what they call the universe is nothing else than the 7th part of the creation, but not the product of an imaginary God or God creator, etc. In truth, they do not even have an idea of the development of the whole, consequently the origin out of the nihilo, out of which all the beginning of all existence found its becoming, is a book with 7 seals to them, which they will not be able to open for a very long time. Also what Sfath said, that Euplagiarin assume the number of galaxies in the one as well as in the other matter belt to be more than 900 billion each. The clever ones of the Earthlings undercut this enormously, for they reckon with something like 100 billion, as far as I know. In any case, the human being of Earth is effectively not the non plus ultra of all intelligence and living beings, as he assumes in his megalomania. He will learn that yet, and to his own sorrow, but that is another matter. What is more, at present the human beings of Earth can see with primitive telescopes, which they consider to be high technology, only something like 14 billion/milliard, 14 billion light-years away and no further. Therefore, he also does not see that the universe is so vast and infinite as he cannot imagine it in reality. He would call the real vastness of the universe infinite, which it is not, however, because even this infinity has its limit. In truth, he sees only the matter belt, to which, however, neither explainable to human beings nor visible to their telescopes, 3 empty spatial dimensions of various consistencies of infinitely empty universe space are set. This, as outside or on the other side of the matter belt, there are also 3 infinitely empty universe spaces of different consistencies. Also, no scientist knows that the whole universe with the 3 empty spaces in front of the matter belt itself, as well as the 3 empty spaces after it, is only of the whole, which is called creation, which holds 7 different universes in itself, which, in addition to the dimension of the present, still hold innumerable dimensions of the past and the future. I don't think I need to explain anything further about this, but with regard to the war in Ukraine, I will mention some other time that America is the real aggressor and is inciting the entire West against Russia, but in this regard it is incomprehensible to me why Earth humans do not recognize this. Language, too, is used as a weapon even by very primitive thinking human beings, creating hatred and revenge and persecution all the more, especially through the English language, which is already learned and used all over the world, which is in the spirit of America and was basically very much striven for at the time of America's creation, whereby the sense at that time was already that not the language English, but America itself should dominate the world. And also in this respect it was a German-born citizen who emigrated to America and proclaimed the English language as the one that was necessary. Billy. Yes, I know that, as well as that the US was eavesdropping, still is, against the intelligence services of many states around the world, with equipment invented and created by the Swiss company. Especially the CIA and the BND and KGB were masters at it, which is probably still the case today. Religious and political terror has also increased, not decreased. I am thinking in particular of the political terror of Islam, but also of the terror of Islamic religion fanatics, and of course, as I have already mentioned, of the terror against the Jewish believers worldwide. And as long as there are still religions and militaries among the peoples of the earth, there will never be peace and harmony, but, on the contrary, even more atrocities. For example, together with Ascot and Semjace, I have seen how in Argentina, for political reasons, human beings were flown far over the sea in airplanes and simply thrown out alive, as a result of which they drowned. When such corpses washed ashore in foreign countries, heavy weights were henceforth attached to the human beings, causing them to sink into the sea and never be found again. The same was true at the time when human beings were stolen and enslaved in Africa. They were tied to chains and simply thrown into the sea when there was a danger of a storm or when they were controlled by foreigners, where the weight of the chains caused them to sink and drown. Today there is a particularly great famine in Africa, and this is not only due to a lack of food, but mainly due to overpopulation, which is especially the case in poor countries. I am aware of all that, but we should now talk about certain things that you should not then call up and write down. Billy. Whatever you say, then.